to make it live. So good morning. My name is Seth Green, and on a morning or evening, depending on where you are, like this one, it is a true pleasure and honor to say that I am the Dean of the Graham School of the University of Chicago. And I want to welcome you all to the Hyde Park campus globally, which is where our headquarters as the Graham School resides. I also want to welcome you to our Hong Kong campus. This event is in partnership with the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Wen campus in Hong Kong. It is the University of Chicago's premier location in Asia, with alumni and friend support led by University of Chicago trustee Francis Wen and his wife Rose. The Wen campus builds upon the University of Chicago's rich tradition of ambitious research, world-class education, and deep institutional collaboration throughout Asia. We are delighted to partner with the Wen campus in this writing program, and we are truly grateful to Shannon and Mark and others there for making this collaboration possible. Let me just tell you, because I see many new faces here, a little bit about the Graham School. We are the lifelong destination learning journey for people across the world who want to engage with the University of Chicago. We are actually a founding division of the university because when William Rainey Harper was setting up this university with John D. Rockefeller, they had a vision to revolutionize university study in this country. And to them, that meant making the cutting edge of the university accessible to all. And so what we do today is provide a comprehensive interdisciplinary UChicago education for adult learners across the world. And we do so for people of all academic backgrounds. There are 4 different program areas that you can engage with at the Graham School. We have a Master of Liberal Arts that is now online and in person, so people can do it from around the world or here in Chicago. It is the most renowned and recognized Master of Liberal Arts of its type. We have a basic program of liberal education for adults that is truly the bedmark of what it looks like to have a deep Socratic education where you look at the great books. We have open enrollment, including our writer studio, which is what we'll be featuring in just a moment with 2 extraordinary instructors who are in the writing dimension. And then we have our annual programs. And those cover everything from the ability to look at better understanding Chicago to globally the arts and museum industry. And with that, let me get to why you are all here today, which is that you want to learn about the art of storytelling through creative writing. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Depika Mukherjee. She is an award-winning author of fiction and poetry and an instructor in our writer studio at the University of Chicago Graham School. Her book, Shambhala Junction, won the UK Virginia Prize for Fiction, and her book, Ode to Broken Things, was longlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize. Her creative work is included in the Best Small Fictions 2019 and appears in World Literature Today, Asia Literary Review, Del Sol Review, and Chicago Quarterly Review. And her essays have appeared in Newsweek, Los Angeles Review of Books, Hemispheres, Orient, Scroll, The Edge, and more. And I will just say, in addition to her being brilliant and an extraordinary writer, I know her as a beloved instructor here in the Writer Studio and as an incredibly kind colleague. And so with that, let me take off the screen share for just a moment so you can see Depika before she then shares her slides with all of you.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you for that amazing introduction. And I'm so delighted to be here today. Thank you to those of you who are in Chicago and woke up so early on a fall morning. I appreciate it. I know exactly how cold it can get. And for those of you who are signing in from various parts of Asia, I'm glad that you are spending time with us after a long day at work or whatever else kept you busy. So very grateful to have you all here. And I will be giving a short introduction to just the art of storytelling through creative writing. And what I would really, really like you all to do as you're listening to this is to take down some questions and ask us through the chat, because I would love this to be interactive. My presentation is very broad because people are from all over, and I don't really know all your backgrounds, but I would be happy, as would Nick, I'm sure, to address some very specific questions at the end. Does that sound good, Seth? Yeah?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, all right, so I'm just going to launch into the actual presentation and share my screen. Fingers crossed that this works. Okay. And here we go. All right. So yeah, just gonna talk about storytelling and creative writing. I assume that most of you are here because you are storytellers or writers of some sort. And I think I'm just going to begin with some things that everybody probably knows. Storytelling is essentially how we make sense of our community and our shared humanity and essentially ourselves. And from the time that we are children on the laps of storytellers, we are told how to tell a story, a riveting story, right? And I've also been kind of more and more interested in how at the end of life, you know, when people are getting dementia or some sort of geriatric senility, showing a picture and getting a senior to talk about stories by evoking the senses can be very therapeutic. And that is just really an interesting thing that I've been exploring as well. So in my own tradition, the Indian one, oral storytellers have always been very important. So we have the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And of course, the epics of the Western canon, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were also transmitted by oral storytellers. And now, those of you who read the magazines and things, I think you may have already seen this. The ACTA people in the Philippines, there was a research done by anthropologists from University College London who found this group of hunter-gatherers in the Philippines. And they found that they used stories to reduce conflict and improve cooperation. But most interestingly is that the best storytellers were more popular than the best hunters and foragers and had greater reproductive success. So storytelling, as some of you already know, is very, very sexy. So if you want to have another reason to just get down and, get that work that you've been sort of thinking about down on paper and out to the world, here's a very good reason. So, oh dear. My thing seems to be stuck. All right, yeah, okay, there we go. But one of the things that I have found in my decades of teaching writing, and I teach both novel writing as well as short story writing, is that students will come to my class and they'll say, well, I've had this idea and I just want to get it out, but I'm not writing for an audience. So I want to start off by saying that actually storytelling and creative writing is not journal writing. I assume that anybody who is here is not here because you want to write journals, but you're here because you want to get your stories out into the world and have them read, maybe touch another person, maybe even change the way people view something. So the most important thing that you have to keep in mind when you have a goal like that, to share your stories with the world, is creative writing as entertainment. Most people will say, well, I kind of write because it's cathartic. I just need to get this off my chest, or I write for my community to find out, what I am, who I am, and what I feel. All of that is well and good, but if you want your stories to reach the world, one of the things that you really have to think about is creative writing as entertainment. On average, a person will spend about $20 odd buying a book, and they'll spend 4 to 5 days reading it. So you have to make your work worth that time as well as money that a reader will invest into what you've done. So I'd like to begin with just a short quote by Sarah Waters. And she says, writing fiction is not self-expression or therapy. Novels are for readers. I think of my novels as being something like fairground rides. My job is to strap the reader into their car at the start of chapter 1, then trundle and whiz them through scenes and surprises on a carefully planned route and at a finely engineered pace. All right. And if you really think about storytelling and oral storytellers, that's exactly what they do. They start off with something that just hooks the reader, and then you are with them for the entire ride. So, I'm going to go a little more into the specifics of that as we go on. But I'd like to address something like right off the bat as we get into this talk, and that is Asian writers are very often perceived as not being equal to, let's say, the white male writer who is writing a debut novel. That is absolutely true. Study after study has shown that Black, Indigenous, people of color, debut novelists essentially get less money for publications, and they also have less publicity budgets. So that means that once your book is out, people are just not reading about it as much as other books. The other thing that I feel very strongly about, especially since I do publish in the United States, there is this issue of peddling your ethnicity. And what I mean by that is when you are a person of color, very often you are assumed to be, writing something about migration, about not being comfortable in your skin, about anomie or assimilation. And people don't really seem to want books by people of color in the United States that are just writing about socio-political issues or something that is a little more mainstream. So there is a problem with that you are sort of categorized as like ethnic writing just because of who you are. There is also a severe problem of lack of Asian MFA programs for people writing from Asia. And Hong Kong did have one of the first programs. And when I was in China teaching until 2012 in Shanghai, I gave a talk in Fudan because they were trying to start a new MFA program there, but it wasn't really, taking off very well. I have also taught in IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology, which is like the MIT in the US. And it was just kind of crazy. I was teaching a creative writing course, and usually my creative writing courses are capped at the most at about 18 to 20 students because it's just so reading and writing intensive. But it ended up being a class for about 45 students, and these 45 students would want to bring their friends because there's such a paucity of writing programs in India. A similar thing is happening in Malaysia, where the University of Nottingham is trying somewhat to introduce creative writing, but it's not like the United States, where people have so many choices in terms of courses and programs. There's also a problem with lack of government money for the arts in Asia, and when the money is available, very often there is discrimination or corruption and a lot of sexism as well, unfortunately. So the Asian diaspora, like me, I write about Asia, but I don't live in Asia all the time. And Asians within Asia also face very different challenges. And that is what I'd call, or rather Vikram Chandra calls, the cult of authenticity. If, for example, Nick is writing about Malaysia, but he doesn't actually live in Malaysia, and I write about India, but I don't live in India, sometimes you are accused of writing for the Western gaze or writing to pander to certain sensibilities and not necessarily to the people that you're writing about. So there are all these issues as Asian writers that we are kind of wrestling with. And as I go through this list, you're probably thinking, why am I even bothering, right? But here's the good news. This is possibly still the best time to be an Asian writer writing from Asia, or actually anywhere in the world, because it is still possible to find a big publisher from Asia while unagented. What happens in America is that the agents act as basically the gatekeepers, and you can't really publish with, let's say, Penguin, Random House, Simon and Schuster, unless you do have an agent taking your manuscript to the publisher. But in India, it's very different because you can still send your manuscripts to all these big publishers who are all here, and you don't have to go through an agent. In Southeast Asia, in Singapore, Penguin is really looking for new manuscripts. And in China, when I left in 2012, they were also really hungry for just fresh Chinese stories. The other thing that I find very heartwarming is that Asian publishing and translation especially is booming. So that means that small presses are also finding new readership. And I think that that is a wonderful, wonderful way to go. So this is from Andrew Kidd, who ran the Folio Prize, and he said, the strongest new voices in literature are emerging from those places where change is dramatic rather than incremental, from where the news is most urgent to report. And very often, I think there's a perception that England or the UK is actually more receptive to Asian writing because of the colonial history and all. But what I would also like to say is that in my experience in America, the prize committees and the general prizes that are being given out in America, there is also a real move towards more diverse and stories of different kinds. The world is really hungry for different kinds of stories. And so I'm just showing you this from the 2018 Neustadt Prize. And it's also often referred to as the American Nobel because people who are finalists for the Neustadt Prize are very often considered for the real Nobel. And I'm not going to really go into who is who out here, but as you can see, the finalists are a very diverse group and people were from all over the world. And this was the jury, and I was on it, and again, the jury was also very, very diverse. So I think that in the United States, although publishing may seem to be still very reluctant to change, the prize giving and the awards, all these juries, they really are hungry for new kinds of stories. So what I'm really trying to say is that if you are having a problem, finding a publisher that is mainstream in the West, think about sending your stories out for awards and just any kind of prizes that are available. Our stories, and I say Asia in a very broad sense because of course it's just such a large part of the world and it's very, very diverse, and Asia's population is equivalent to 60% of the total world population, so it's huge. And whether we like it or not, Asia, Asians, we live in exciting, turbulent times. And I don't really have to go very much into that. And if you really think about Asia as a place for stories, when you think of diversity in Europe, in Germany, Netherlands, Brussels, let's say, the languages are mutually intelligible, the foods are not that different, and religion is pretty much, kind of the same. Whereas you go to Asia, and we'll just take Malaysia, Thailand, and Laos, all right? The language is they are not mutually intelligible, food, religion. So there are like lots and lots of stories that are still not told from Asia. Um, and what I would like to suggest for those of you who are not already familiar with it is go to Poets and Writers. And Poets and Writers has a regular list of, people, they have a regular list of calls for, submissions. They have awards. They have writing residencies. So they're a really good online free source for people who want to get into the writing business. There are also these no-fee submissions. Both of these mentioned here are from the UK, the Commonwealth Short Story Prize and the Sunday Times EFG Short Story Award. And some American journals periodically open up for fee-free submissions. And the reason I mention this is that I am very aware of the fact that if submissions for an award are like $25 in the US, then when it's converted into Malaysian ringgit or the Indian rupee, that's quite a sum. So, there are free things as well that that writers can find. In terms of tips for actually writing, I think that one of the things that I tell my students, and I'd like to tell you as well, that basically there are very few stories. There are, these things like the hero's quest, and, somebody is going to find something, and that is replicated in stories from Star Wars to the epics, So I think that the stories in terms of themes, there are really just not that many. What makes a story interesting is how it is told and how it's told differently. So I always tell my students to write from your life. And what that means is that don't be derivative. Just because something has hit the New York Times bestseller list, last week, and you think that that might be the way to go, it is, if you're just going to kind of try to do what has already been done, it's just going to be a derivative, kind of piece of writing that nobody is going to be that interested in because they've read that already. But if you write from your life, and I think that this is true of fiction as well as nonfiction, even when somebody writes like a dystopian tale or a science fiction, fantasy kind of a thing, the characters are very often composites of people that you have met or known. And it is, it's often said that a writer's first novel tends to be more autobiographical than anything else. And that's certainly true of my Ode to Broken Things, which is set in Malaysia. And some of the scenes that I kind of developed in that book were actually anecdotes from my life, which I kind of then put into a storyline. So if you are starting off writing, what I'd like you to start thinking about is think of self-contained incidents that are still vivid in your mind. And if you remember them, they probably contain universal truths that your readers will also recognize. And then just write the best story you can without any self-censorship, no matter where in the world you are. Just write it for yourself. The first draft is written for the writer and the last draft is written for the reader. And there is a lot of editing in between. But the first draft should be like just white hot passion for something that you really want to just get out into the world. And I'd also like to say that, as you're writing the first draft, think about being vulnerable, being honest, because this first draft is for you. So write from a point that is true to yourself, because I think after that you can edit out the parts that are just too controversial maybe for you to publish. But the first draft should really, really feel like it's a piece of your heart just pulled out from your chest. The other thing that I have sometimes problems convincing new writers about is you must have conflict. So to give you an example, I think a lot of people in this group will know Lord of the Flies, right? So there's a bunch of people in this, bunch of children, really, boys, who are marooned, and they basically end up trying to kill each other. think about it if it was like a Boy Scout story and everybody just helped each other build tents and, cook together until they got rescued. It would be such a boring story. It may like be a heartwarming story, but it wouldn't be the same story. What drives fiction and also more and more nonfiction in our times is conflict. So work on building up to your climax. Conflict is good because it makes the reader care about what's at stake, what's going to happen. And the way to think about this is if you write fiction, you have a protagonist, and the protagonist should be tested and grow through trials and tribulations. Just when you think that your protagonist is going to save the world, something even worse should happen to her, so that you keep flipping the pages. If you're writing a memoir or creative nonfiction, this is where it gets tricky because you are the protagonist and you need to be honest about your own trials and your own growth. And you need to be really interesting on the page. No one really wants to just read about somebody who is perfect and achieves everything on time and, is like the good Asian role model. So try to think about writing about conflict, even if it's a conflict that is resolved at the end, because it is really that which keeps the reader engaged. Some of the ways that I get my sort of newbie writers started, if you are sort of really mind blocked and you don't know what you want to write about, is I suggest starting with photographs. Take a photograph from your family album or maybe a piece of art on your wall that really speaks to you. And I want you all to sort of think about if you can step into the frame and bring the picture to life in some way. Especially, I want people to if they're especially mind blocked, this works very well. Can you make the subject or any character in the art or photo speak? And I usually have people not speak from their own point of view, even if they are in the picture, but take the character of the grumpy uncle or the overworked grandma or the child who would rather be breaking things than having, sitting at the table. And it is that point of tension that should be highlighted, which is right now hidden in the picture. But once you bring that out and you start speaking in the voice of this grumpy uncle or this mad, mother, then that's where the story starts to take off. And as you're writing, I want you to lead the reader into your story. What I mean by that is that the reader should have an experience that they're actually walking along the streets that you're describing and they're in the room where the scene is unfolding. So the ways that you do this is by including specific sensual details. Don't just say how tall a person is, but have them duck as they are going through a doorway or maybe getting into a cave. Does someone have a wart on their thumb? The color of the curtains on a rainy day and how that makes someone feel. These kind of, things that make sensual details come alive. Smells are really great for building ambience, and especially if you are talking about childhood nostalgia and, bringing that into your writing. There is that old kind of saying about showing and not telling, and a bit of both is actually necessary. But I think writing, storytelling of any kind really works best when you let the reader kind of build these word pictures in their own mind, because you've brought a scene alive sensually. Pay attention to punctuation. Newbie writers use too many exclamation marks, but the punctuation can make a difference between the drab and the dramatic. And I'm just giving you one line from a poem, and that's a very old poem by Lord Byron. And I just want you to look at this one line, and it just goes, one kiss, one more, another, oh, adieu. And in this one line, you have haste, you have love, you have like longing, and it's just one line with punctuation. I teach entire classes on dialogue writing. So this is like a very, very short demonstration. Instead of writing, he shouted at me to come over. If you say something like, quick, come over here right now, you can immediately feel that sense of urgency. Dialogue is great for getting the story to speak to your reader. All right, I think I'm running out of time, so I hope I'm not too much overset. Please just, wave your arms, but this is my last slide. Okay, I really would like to sort of end with a call for action. I think one of the things that we can do in terms of being writers is also just, build a community and help other Asian writers. So the first thing that I would suggest that you do, and I assume that I'm speaking to a large Asian, group here, read Asian writers, promote Asian writing. If you like some writer that you've read, talk about it on a blog, on social media, do online reviews of Goodreads, on Amazon, wherever you can, it really helps. If you're a teacher like me, include Asian writers in your teaching curriculum. I've just found it's so rich in sort of opening up the world. I really found it very useful to form a community of writers, whether it's critique group. That's actually how I met Nick in Chicago, because we were part of the same fiction critique group. And finally, if you have the means, start an Asian Writing Award or even an online journal, preferably something that pays writers in money as well as validation. Something that really bothers me about the writing field right now is that it's too expensive now for everyone to be a writer, because writing just doesn't pay a living wage. So the only people who can afford to be writers are sort of people who have the means to not have to work. And some of the best stories come from people who are not privileged in that way. So think about ways, and just, you can support writers who have stories, but not necessarily the means to write. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, Seth, and just turn this over to you. And I hope that we have a lot of questions.
We already do have questions coming in because of your brilliant presentation and the insights that you shared, both on the marketplace and how to think about equity in it, and on how to think about great writing and storytelling. I want to bring in the other guest speaker here, who is going to be a shared panelist now as we begin moving into audience and question. Nicholas Y.H. Wong, who you see on your screen, is assistant professor in the School of Chinese at the University of Hong Kong. He also writes poetry under his pen name, Zhu Sivan. His 3 chapbooks are Zero Cupola, See Hypocrisy, and The Geometry of Trees, which is forthcoming. And most exciting for me is that he received his PhD in comparative literature here at the University of Chicago, and we're very proud of what he is doing with that education. Nick, let me start with you to bring you into this conversation. Depika just shared an array of tips for storytelling. Do you have any tips to add to Depika's?
Firstly, thank you so much, Seth and Depika, for involving me in this conversation. Obviously, I come from a very different perspective, which is I teach close reading in literature classes, and I teach translation, particularly from Chinese into English. So I engage creative writing on the side. But hearing Depika sharing, I had a couple of thoughts. I fully agree with Depika, and I can think of some practical tips of storytelling. Most of us have daytime jobs, and you can write about them. And when Depika says to think of self-contained incidents that are vivid, I think the best place is to draw from your own life, right? You live probably in the office or certain workspaces for a huge part of the day. So draw on your technical expertise, your workplace frustration. You can choose to ignore it, and also choose to write about other areas to free your mind. So in which case you do a lot of research and read. Wikipedia is a good friend. Read journals that you're not familiar with, expand your horizons. And also, if you hear snippets of conversation that you overhear in the elevator, write them down in a journal. let your imagination run wild, because these are really interesting raw materials that you can transform into real scenarios and situations that your characters inhabit. So even if you're not really approaching writing and storytelling as a full-time vocation or a job, you can write on the side, and you can write whenever you want to and have something to address. So it is more a reaction and a response to day-to-day situations that you have. And I like what Depika says about the universal truths that your readers will recognize. I encourage you to tap into the diversity of human experience and emotions, not just confining yourselves to certain labels of your ethnic makeup or how you find yourselves being labeled in real life, because really, after all, the human is a universal category, and this is how we engage other people as well. And I like what you said, Depika, about writing without self-censorship, right? Honesty and vulnerability. When you write, you really face your intimate dreams and your fears, your preoccupations. You're more than what others see you on the outside, more than just an easy soundbite. You're not a trendy label next to your byline, but you're really a full person coming to this idea of storytelling. So I'll just stop here and see where our conversation leads.
I want to pick up on this idea of, being vulnerable and being honest that both of you are speaking to. And ask, how do you approach that? We're living in a world where, and there's a lot of data on this, in social media and other settings, we're, kind of trained just to share our accomplishments and put forward, the most attractive pictures of ourselves in all forms of that meaning. How do you find that vulnerability? How do you get confidence and comfort with telling that, even in fiction where it may not be, directly attributable? Maybe, Depika, we can start with you and then come to you, Nick.
Yeah, sure. I think, as you said, Seth, I think it's a little easier in fiction, because what you really are doing is your character is kind of thinking like that, or your character is behaving in a certain way. I think that when I was writing Shambhala Junction, I really did want to address the issue of how Asians have a lot of stereotypes about Asia as well, about poverty and dirt and just general, whatever. And so I created this character that did think in a lot of ways in the way that I would honestly sometimes think when I landed in, let's say, New Delhi airport. And I didn't want to make it all glossy, everything is perfect, here is my motherland and I kiss the ground, which is kind of, again, another, strange way to write. But I think that now what has happened lately is that in 2016, my eldest brother had a traumatic brain injury. And so lately I've been actually writing a lot of nonfiction about the brain and family dynamics. And I do have some interest in that book, but what I'm really struggling with right now is, as I'm writing my family story, I have to get into my mother's spiraling into depression. And mental health is still very, very stigmatized in Asian societies. And the way that you talk about parents is still very much circumscribed by your position in that hierarchy of filial piety and things like that. So I have really been struggling with that, how to, in a sense, help other people who must be going through very similar things, without sort of hurting the feelings of the people that I'm writing about, and certainly not my family. So I don't really have an answer for that, but I also think that some of the work that I've been reading by Asians, where they do delve into, family and mental health issues, that has been very helpful for me. And so I would like to, in a way, pay it back by also being very honest and vulnerable and just truthful, really, you know, about what's going on with us.
Thank you, Depika, and a powerful example. Nick?
Right. About honesty and vulnerability, I feel like I tend to be more obscure and shy about what I write, because when I want to divulge my identity, right? When I started my process of writing poetry, it was underpinned by my gay identity that was unresolved. And it sort of made me do the opposite in writing, which is to be unclear and obscure in what I said in my poetry as a way to protect myself, right? So I use poetry as, rather than other forms of writing, such as nonfiction, because poetic language is obscure, it's abstract, metaphorical, but I also wanted to be heard and express my desires openly, which created this tension in what I want to say and how it came out on paper. So how to package this slipperiness of my identity for readers to feel and understand was something I was working with, right? I think the best outcome of this was that I experimented with poetic form. So in my first poetry chapbook, Zero Copula, it was about using the sonnet form and transforming it to synthesize my experience as a gay person studying in Chicago. And I was reading contemporary American poetry, being steeped in Asian American discourses. So this is my initial answer to your question.
Can I follow up on that, Nick? Because in the chat, Lauren Carpenter asks, I had a question for Nicholas. How has your experience with identity been as someone who publishes with a pen name? And so I'm curious if maybe building on, that discussion of maybe obscuring, you can just speak a little bit about publishing with a pen name and, the why behind that, as well as the impact that you feel that had, positive or adverse.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So around 2014, I came up with a pen name, Joe Sivan, and Joe and Sivan are actually Chinese and Jewish first and last names. I remember the terrible stereotype of Chinese as Jews of Southeast Asia, which circulated around the early 20th century and still continues until this day. So I thought about minoritizing impulses, right? That is why people feel the need to compare one minority group to another, and what such comparisons mean to them and to someone like me who's perceived as a member of one group. So because I have a Chinese last name, Wong, for example. So the pen name is really a reminder to myself to challenge this kind of thinking and go beyond our ethnic boxes and comfort zones and write with other so-called minorities in mind. So not just one owns identity as a minority, right? Not just my own gay identity that I supposedly own. So writing allows me, using this pen name, to become minor. If you think of Deleuze and Guattari's theory, right? To become minor rather than to just be a minority of the minority that you are. So I think evolving out of this pen name is my second chapbook, See Hypocrisy, where I wrote it from the perspective of someone who has a passport and an ID. So it's the chapbook grapples with the difficulty of writing about undocumented peoples and stateless peoples. I was thinking about xenophobic sentiments in Malaysia towards migrant laborers and refugees as reflected in news reports about discovery of mass graves on the border of Thailand and Malaysia of certain refugees. And I sort of channeled my anger at the situation back in 2015 using different poetic forms and also using satire. So I hope that's a response to your question of my pen name.
So we have another question here from Sheila Parsari, who asks about aspects of oral storytelling and how those can be used on the page. And, it's a really interesting question because you were mentioning that these oral stories are very engaging and entertaining, and many of them are, shared across generations, but not written down. Can you just talk a bit about how that process of, writing them down and putting them on the page can work? And maybe we'll start, Depika, with you.
Yeah, and thanks, Shella, for that question. Shella's a student, and she's a wonderful writer. So I hope to see her work out soon. Shella, in terms of aspects of oral storytelling, I think oral storytellers are very, very tuned in to not boring their audience. Part of it is also because you can actually see eyes that are glazing over and body language that is like shifting and wants to leave. So some of the things that happens very often in storytelling is that it starts off with like, you know, the characters. Once there was a king and a queen and they lived here, and it sets up the, you know, the scene in which things will happen. And then something happens very, very quickly. And the story kind of just develops, you know, from that. And that's really what I was saying, that set up the conflict very early, set it up so that it is also a series of escalating conflicts that the characters are responding to. And as they're responding, there is character growth and development. So all of this is very much there in oral storytelling, where the characters and the action and everything is just sort of very smoothly going on. And the listeners are just absolutely riveted because they just don't have time to be bored. So I think that there's a lot in terms of oral storytelling strategies that can be used by not only people who are writing, but definitely people who make movies use a great deal of that. Yeah.
Nick, anything you want to add?
Just briefly to say that epic poetry, you know, the genre of storytelling, right, that we're familiar with is constantly reminding audiences of the topic. And so it is a way of signposting what you're talking about. But I think when it's transferred to the page, that signposting takes very different forms. So you don't have to constantly remind the reader of it, but it's a sort of distortion, right? And people think about this distortion in many ways. Interruption of the narrative, defamiliarization, and so on and so forth.
So we have another question from G. Gosek, and I'll just read the first part directly. When literature awards put high priority on equity, doesn't that run a great risk of politicization to the detriment of genuine quality? And, you know, I'm curious if each of you could just comment on that. I know that a lot of what we have considered in the past to be genuine quality has been a very narrow understanding. And so I'm just curious if each of you can comment on how do you move in this direction potentially and still remain, which I know, you know, your jury prize was very focused on, Depika, focused on, you know, this genuine quality.
Yes, absolutely. I think that I think it's a great question. It really is. But I think that the assumption there is that in looking for a diversity of voices, there isn't quality in that diversity. And I would just strongly disagree. I think that what has happened generally in the past is that when you have a jury that is made up of the same kind of people with the same kind of life experiences, then they tend to, I mean, you know, we don't read literature without the lens of our own experience coming into it. Absolutely nobody who is human can do that. So when you're familiar with certain tropes and symbols and things, you tend to gravitate towards those and say, yeah, I mean, you know, that speaks to me. When you have more diversity in a jury, what happens is you just have more world experiences. And as, you know, somebody said, of course, you know, very jokingly recently to me, that the Asian concept of horror is someone running through the house with their outdoor shoes on. And so I think That's really the kind of things that we're looking at, that, what is humor? What is horror? What is good writing for a group of people? And then, of course, they come to a consensus. And it's ultimately like, we had people like Amitav Ghosh and Patricia Highsmith and all kinds of like really, really lauded people who were finalists for this prize. And ultimately, the person who won it was the Haitian writer. I'm sorry, I'm having one of these senior moments. But she's also, very, very, very well published and awarded many times. So I think the thing is that, when we start to think that, okay, if there's diversity, there is going to be a lowering of standards, that in itself I find problematic, because in my own life, I'm just going to give you an anecdote from a very recent thing that happened. I had submitted my poetry manuscript, my second one, and it got accepted fairly quickly. And when it did, I found out that one of the first readers, and this was from Cavern Press in New Jersey, happened to be Malaysian. And, just having readers who are from different backgrounds and who read a poem that is, let's say, on Malaysia and Asia through the lens of experience, and they say, hey, this speaks to me, then just pushed my manuscript forward and it was accepted. With my first manuscript, I was not that lucky. It took me a long time to get published. So all I'm saying is that the more diversity we have, the more sorts of stories we have. It's not a lowering of the bar in any respect at all.
Thank you, Depika. Nick, anything to add?
No, I think Depika has answered it very eloquently. So I'll leave it.
Well, thank you both. I'm going to go now to a question from Shivantha Fernando. And this is a question for you, Depika, but we will open it up to both of you. She says, do you think intersectionality is a challenge for Asian writers, being an Asian and being a woman? A question mark. There are certain expectations from society, from women, more so for women from Asia and South Asia. What are some of the challenges you have faced in this area? And then maybe we can just, take that to you, Nick, with the unique intersectional identity that you bring as a, similar question. But Depika, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Shivanti. That's a great question, and it's one that I get fairly often. So I think I can just, answer that with very specific examples. When I was trying to publish my debut novel, which was, of course, a socio-political story set in Malaysia, one of the first people who requested the full manuscript was the person who was representing Jhumpa Lahiri. And of course, Jhumpa Lahiri she became famous for writing a certain kind of an immigrant narrative about Bengali people. And so I think the expectation was that I would also be writing a migrant narrative, but I wasn't. I was writing about current politics in Malaysia and the identity of the protagonist as an Indian woman who had been, Malaysian Indian woman, was like just incidental, really. I mean, I could have made her a Chinese Malaysian. It didn't really matter. So the feedback that I got back was that story was too political for America, which actually just blows my mind even now when I think about it. What is too political for America? But when I thought about it, I realized that what the person was really trying to tell me is that Malaysia is just not on the radar in America the way that Vietnam is or Saudi Arabia is. And I wasn't writing the story of this poor woman who had run off from this, horrible, horrible place that she was born into and making this life in a more golden place. I was writing about a woman in a context that was Asian and, very well, I thought I was writing a timely novel. So yes, very much there are expectations of the sorts of stories I should be writing. And with my second novel, The Shambhala Junction as well, I had a lot of issues because I was writing about a woman kind of not having a happy ending, you know, even though it was a very dark story. So I think that, yes, Shubhanti, to answer your question, it is a problem, and it's something that I constantly have to be very vigilant in fighting. And I probably lost a lot of publishing opportunities, but, you know, I would rather stand behind a book that I'm proud of, because unfortunately, once it's published, it literally follows you for the whole of your life. and even if in 10 years you realize, oh my God, I would never write a book like that again, it's out there with your name on it. So that's that.
Nick, can we come to you on that same type of question about how intersectional identity can both box you in some ways and also how you challenge that?
Right. So if you think of my identity as in terms of nationality, right? I've moved in different places. I was born in Malaysia. I studied in Singapore and the US, and now I'm in Hong Kong. So what country do I represent is often asked of me, right? Interestingly, when I was in the US, one academic reviewed my poetry collection and studied it as an example of Asian American poetry. And I'm really grateful to be brought into that discussion, because I think Asian American poetry is going through a lot of discussions about whether form matters more than identity, right? To just reduce the conversation a little bit. So I find myself slotted into different boxes. Do I represent a kind of post-colonial Anglophone voice from Malaysia? Am I a gay Singapore writer, a poet? Because if you know, the Singapore poetry scene is really thriving. And the fact that I was there and I studied and learned from it, do I qualify to be part of that group? But often I find myself being rendered invisible because I do not belong to any category at all. So I think the challenge for me is, how do I guess, publicize or present myself? And if you were to ask me, I rather remain unclassifiable, because I truly believe that people should get something from the work itself rather than the labels, because labels are for people who are busy and on the move.
Well, so we are. Yeah, thank you both. This has been amazing. We're at our final question, and I'm going to make it a power round, 45-second or less questions, so we end on time, because we've got about 90 seconds remaining. So here is the big question for which you have very little time to answer. The global trade of creative writing has grown dramatically. We've seen a huge rise during the pandemic in both authoring and in readership. What do you see as the single biggest opportunity and challenge ahead for creative writers in very short form? Nick, can we start with you on that question?
Yes, I think since I should mention that my poetry chapbooks have been published by small presses, so meaning publishers who work on a small scale, a small overhead, small print run, focus on informal distribution networks and a targeted readership. So I see the challenges in creative writing as one about how small presses and publishers can survive and flourish in the digital age and in an environment of major publishers and big tech dominating the publishing industry. It's difficult to answer that question, but I think one of the ways we can contribute positively is to go to local bookstores, support local writers, and form self-organize and form small reading groups.
Thanks, Nick. And Depika, our final word.
Okay, 45 seconds or less. Okay, I think unfortunately was that one of the issues, the challenges have been actually bigger than the opportunities. So there's a major supply chain issue right now, which is leading to books just not being available in bookstores. And the publishing industry has slowed down during the pandemic. So there's a backlog of books waiting to be published. Literary agents without childcare have not been able to sort of commission, new writers. So there is really a slowdown in terms of getting published right now or having your books available in bookstores. In terms terms of opportunities, what has been really exciting for me personally to see is the growth of Netflix, because everybody watches Netflix, and Netflix is looking for good books to make into, into the visual medium. And I think that sort of bypasses this big Hollywood, Bollywood kind of, dynamic. And The Maid, is written by somebody that I know from a group. And I have friends in India who've just been, taken up for that kind of, from book to screen. And I think that that is exciting, the fact that people are watching more and books are being transformed into the visual medium.
Well, I will just concur with everyone who is writing into our chat how excellent this discussion was. You both are extraordinary writers and thinkers and storytellers, and we are grateful for your sharing your story of creative writing with all of us this morning. And thank you to those who woke up early or who are going to bed with us tonight. I will say, as someone who is on the early wake-up side, this was the best reason on earth to wake up early, and I'm very grateful for all that I've learned. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day or the next day, depending on where you are. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.